I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Government Analytics program here at Johns Hopkins. We're so glad you're joining us this morning. So we've been hosting this Government Analytics Breakfast Forum along with REI Systems for about 5 years now. And the purpose is to bring together professionals in government, as well as those in academia, to discuss how analytics are being used in the public sector. Today we're presenting the results of the first annual Government Analytics Survey. Jeff and I will present those results for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll invite our panelists to comment on the findings, kind of going back through the slides. So don't worry if you miss things as Jeff and I are presenting. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists before Jeff and I get started. We are very grateful to be joined today by Michael Conlon, the Chief Data Officer from the Department of Defense. Dr. Colin Pascal, who's a new faculty member here at Johns Hopkins with the Government Analytics Program. Pat Whoo, who is the Director of the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. And William Wietrowski, who is the Deputy Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So quite an expert panel today. We encourage you to tweet about the forum if you so wish using the hashtag #GabForum. And note that a recording will be posted on our websites about 24 to 48 hours afterwards if you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues. So with that, I will let Jeff talk a little bit about the Gab Forum.
Sure. We'll also be happy to share with you the slides and the results of this research. They'll be posted on the same website where the video is archived so you can access them. Just to put in a plug kind of a year early, we are sure we didn't get this all right the first time, so we'll be inviting and hope to have your suggestions to improve the survey, add questions or topics, figure out a different way to deal with a tough issue. Just about the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum series, every other month we invite someone from government to talk about an analytic technique they used, how they succeeded, what types of information certain types of agencies or levels of professionals in government are interested in. And essentially the purpose of the breakfast is to form a stronger community so that rather than kind of living alone in your own silo without any way to solve a problem, give you a sense that there are some other folks going through the same thing and a network to contact to help you solve tough problems and to commiserate with occasionally. And that actually really brings to mind the motivation for why we wanted to conduct this analytics survey. And really kind of, I think it's a little bit in my mind like the cobbler's children have no shoes. Analysts in the analytics community think, and in fact the survey confirms, that they think there is not enough resources going into government analytics and that more value could be had. Yet it's very difficult to say in any sort of reliable evidence-based way, what is the value of the analytics that we're doing? And so we wanted to try and tackle that as best we could. And we think we've actually made some really interesting inroads with the results of this survey that we'll present to you. But again, we would like your suggestions on how to better capture that question. How valuable are analytics? When and where do they work best? What needs to be improved about them? And that's really the purpose of this survey effort. So with no further ado, let's start into some of the survey results. And we'll start with the slides. Do we have a clicker that works, or do we?
Yes.
We do. Great. Okay. I nevertheless am likely to stand up here because I can't memorize more than 3 words. And so I'm going to have to use my notes as we go along. To start with, that's not what I wanted. Sorry. That one, yeah. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about we talked a little bit about the purpose of the introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about methodology, respondents, findings, why and we've grouped the findings into these buckets. Why agencies use analytics and what types they use, value that's obtained, the resources, staff, skills, types of tools and methods used, the things that were most prominently identified as a key to success and or challenges, and then finally a couple of takeaways. We couldn't resist, having been a lifelong consultant, saying, well, what should government do about this? So we've identified a couple or 3 suggestions that you may say, you know, those are all wrong, let me suggest something else instead. But again, it's intended to kind of stoke the discussion. So sorry, Michael?
Did you say what hashtag you want us to tweet?
Oh, Gab Forum, G-A-B Forum.
One word.
It's
Yes.
Government Analytics Breakfast. So on behalf of our organizations, the Johns Hopkins program is actually unusual because in our experience around the Washington region, nobody else really has a program academically focusing on government analytics. It's an important program that offers both part-time as well as full-time opportunities for people who are either pre-career or in the middle of their career. REI Systems is a contractor working with a variety of government agencies providing analytic solutions, including data management as well as development and operation of models, analytical results, and advice. ACT-IAC, helping kind of make sure that people are aware of this and encouraging response and providing some important feedback during the beta test efforts of our survey, as you may know, is a collaboration between both government IT professionals and industry. So it brings kind of the best of both worlds in a neutral setting. I kind of gave you a picture of the purpose of this survey. The design, I have to give you as an upfront kind of caveat. This is a voluntary response survey. It is not a statistically selected, random sample, nor is it stratified. So we can't say this can easily be extrapolated with a high level or any particular level of confidence. Those are the caveats. Respondents included folks from state, local, federal government agencies, nonprofits, academia, and the private sector. So again, it's folks who are interested responded. We would love to have your suggestions about how to get more responses next year so that we'll have a broader and more interesting set of results. But we do think that despite the fact that it is not a statistically significant randomly selected sample, it's providing some really interesting information. As we move on, we again, in the interest of being forthright and honest, we had about 250 people start the survey, about 106 completed it. A significant portion of those were folks who've been in the analytics community for more than 10 years. So these are actually some fairly experienced folks. At this stage, again, we can't tell you, well, this is actually really what the analytics community looks like. Maybe that we just didn't succeed in getting responses from the folks who were first year or two of their careers. As you can see also with the dark blue on the right, a significant portion, a little more than half of the respondents were from the federal sector, but that they did represent a variety of other sectors. So this was what may seem like a superficial question, which is, what do you spend your time doing? But we thought there were a couple of interesting pieces for it, and so what I'd like to do is seed the entire audience, and particularly our panel, with some questions now. And that is, people spend the most part of their time, who responded to the survey, gathering data. So the question I have is, are there ways to automate that? Ways to, instead of having kind of your rocket scientist, professional analyst, not spend so much time gathering data, but instead spend their time developing models, operating models, testing and improving models, interpreting results, acting on results. So that's one question. The second piece, although you may not be able to see it quite easily, is work not related to analytics. Apparently folks have kind of a second or third hat, do a variety of other things. The third most significant use of people's time, and these are often corresponded to a particular question in the survey, how much of the time you spend on government analytics goes to the following activities. The third most frequent response was communicating the results of analysis. And what that leads me to kind of think is, the folks in the analytics community I know, not all of them are really good at communications, either in written or in oral form. And so that may actually be something where there's an opportunity to improve perhaps educational practices, perhaps recruiting practices, to strengthen the ability to communicate about analytics, so that in fact, where you reach a really important conclusion, actually someone does something about it or does something with it. So again, I'm not going to kind of go through in all of the detail, all of the topics in the slides. The slides are available to you after the fact. But I would like you to think about kind of those couple of questions with respect to this slide, because as we finish the presentation after Dr. Bachner and I are finished, we'll invite not only the panelists to answer some specific questions that we as facilitators have cooked up, but we'll ask you as the audience to think about what are the topics related to this that you're interested and curious about as well, especially if they may be of interest to the broader analytics community. So let me give you kind of a quick overview. You can leave when I'm done with this because you've heard the heights of it, but there actually is quite a bit of interest in the depth as well, so I hope you'll stick around. The first, I think, is actually tremendously good news, which is that analytics are important. Government is paying attention to evidence. And the bottom line, the way we treated this was, we asked, of the three most significant program or strategy decisions in your agency over the past year, were analytics playing a factor? And 82% of respondents basically said yes. They said either 5, on a scale of 1 to 5, they were a dominant factor, or 4, of significant importance, or 3, at least equal to other factors. And so the bottom line is, according to our survey respondents, analytics are making a difference in important program and strategy decisions, which I think is great. And I think it's really good news because this tells us this is an example of value. The second significant finding is that if your analytics focus on money, they're not going to be as impactful. And we did this by kind of cross-analyzing a couple of questions. One was, what is your motivation for using analytics? Is it to evaluate a program that's been implemented? Is it to inform prospectively a policy or program choice? Is it to justify your budget and kind of try and protect or obtain more funding? Is it to cut costs? Those last two we consider to be kind of the financial components, which is justify your budget and cut costs. People who said that was their primary motivation for doing analytics reported much less frequently that their analytics played a significant role in the program and strategy decisions of their agencies. So the bottom line is, why you do the analytics seems to impact whether or not they have an outcome or a result that's valuable to you and your agency. And so again, we're going to kind of precede some questions here. Why is that? How does what are the mechanics of how the motivation for the analytics make an impact? The third topic is, we've already kind of touched on this, people spend most of their time gathering data and a little bit of time acting on it and a bunch of time in the middle kind of communicating about it. So the question is, how can we do about that? What can we do about that? Should we do something about that? Is that right? And kind of one of the subsidiary questions that's just my pet curiosity, are we gathering the data just because there's data there to be gathered? Or are we thinking about what is the problem we want to solve? Who is the audience we want to communicate to? Do we have the right data to be able to solve that problem and communicate to that audience? And letting the purposes of our analytics drive our data gathering. Because to be honest with you, my suspicion is that in many agencies, we just take the data we have available and the data that's easy to capture, and then we cut out the stuff that we find to be not of quality or not valid. And we analyze what's left and figure out what can we analyze with that data. Not always true, but that'll be, I think, again, an interesting topic for a little bit more detailed discussion. The fourth one I was surprised by, and that is 26 and 25%, respectively, said machine learning and artificial intelligence are the most promising tools for government to use in the future. More and higher than any other option that we presented. What that means is everybody likes the idea of machine learning and artificial intelligence, but when we said, all right, how many of your agencies are using it? 4% using machine learning and artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. And so again, the kind of preceding question, why is that? What should be done about it? Should something be done about it? Is that wrong or is that okay? Then the last topic is kind of what are the biggest challenges facing you? And far and away the biggest challenge was staffing. And to a certain extent I suspect that was having enough money to hire staff, attracting the staff, perhaps in competition with the private sector or other entities, and to a certain extent kind of training and development and having staff kind of gain the cutting edge as the cutting edge evolves. So those are kind of the key findings. Let me move on and ask Jen to talk a little bit about how agencies use analytics and which analytics tools they use.
Okay, so as Jeff said, I'll be talking about why agencies are using analytics and which approaches and tools they are using. We found that the two most common motivations or purposes for using analytics in government are twofold. One, to improve an agency's performance, and two, to inform its strategy and decision making. In contrast, we found that financially motivated reasons, tying back to what Jeff was talking about, were far less common. Far fewer respondents indicated that a primary goal of analytics was to justify a budget or reduce costs. And in fact, reducing costs was the least popular answer, which may not be surprising to those in government. The most frequent target audience for government analytics appears to be an agency's career executives, and this aligns with the primary motivation being to improve strategy and decision making. That said, it's also clear from the results that analysts expect their work to be used by a variety of different stakeholders, and these stakeholders include the agency's political leaders, Congress, as well as the general public. We found that traditional statistical approaches, and that includes descriptive analyses, dominate in terms of the type of analytics that are being used. We also found that qualitative methods are widely used, and I found this quite reassuring given that, as I'm sure many of you know, a complete analysis often requires both quantitative and qualitative approaches. Again, harkening back to what Jeff was talking about, we found that the use of big data and AI methods are not widespread, despite being such hot topics. We think that this may be because the government is still building capacity in this area, but it might also be because traditional approaches are often all that's necessary in order to answer the questions at hand. In terms of software that's being used, we found that free and open source programs, namely R and Python, are dominant. These programs have a steeper learning curve than traditional point-and-click programs, but they are much better in terms of developing transparent and reproducible analyses. We also found that Tableau is the most widely used tool for creating data visualizations. We also gave respondents an opportunity in the comments to mention other programs that we're using, and people noted that they're using Excel, Minitab, and PowerPoint. So Jeff will now say a few words about the value that government agencies are obtaining from analytics.
So once again, this is a topic area where we think we've kind of begun to try and tackle the problem, but we haven't really got it quite finished, and so we're hoping for your input. I brought the clicker.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. So what we found was that to start with, we wanted to kind of get a scope of the issue, and so we want to know how much are people spending. Again, this is self-reported, and it's within kind of bands, so it's not necessarily precise. But the significant portion of the analytics operations that we received responses from were relatively small or at the smaller end of the range. I'm sorry, were relatively large or at the larger end of the range. 1 to 10 million being spent by folks who were 29% of the respondents. I apologize, that's kind of the middle of the range. The next group was kind of the very smallest shops. Relatively few shops were large. But overall, if you take the responses of all of these folks, the survey respondents essentially kind of represent an analytics investment of about $1.6 billion across the government. What I found interesting, though, is, that's less than maybe is being spent on a border wall, more than is being spent on some other topics. Nevertheless, 77% of respondents believe their organization spends too little or far too few resources on analytics. And so I think one of the places where we hope, again, to kind of see the question is, well, what would you do if you had more money? And I think that's something where we try and minimize the number of open response questions on the survey so that we actually don't ask people to spend 3 hours doing it. But this, I think, will be a perfect opportunity for you, both as panelists and as members of the audience in this room, to say, here's what I think we would do if we spent more money and what would be the most valuable places to spend it. And accompanying that, of course, will be the next couple of topics, which is, well, and how do you tell whether or not you're going to get enough value to warrant that additional investment? What we also found, although just barely was interesting, was that 52% of respondents perceive that executive leaders and managers use data analytics to a significant extent or to a great extent. 5 and 4 on a 5-point scale, 1 to 5 scale. And so many, but clearly not all, executives are interested in analytics and kind of pay attention to the results of the analysts who reported in our survey. This is the kind of the highlight I mentioned earlier in terms of the value, which is that in a majority of cases, the respondents to the survey felt that the analysis and their analytic efforts played a significant role, either a dominant, prominent, or essentially kind of a role equal to other factors in the most significant program and policy strategy decisions that were made. So we think, again, if you can say, here's a better way to judge value, we would love to hear it. But this is telling us there's some pretty substantial value in most cases, most agencies, 80+% of the agencies or organizations that responded. This is kind of the data behind the point about, well, if you're focusing on the money, you're probably not going to have as much impact. And the bottom line is that of the agencies that said their analytics played a dominant role in their 3 most significant strategy decisions, only 18% of them, or I'm sorry, of the agencies that mentioned of the agencies that mentioned that the level, the kind of the 1 to 5 point level of the significance of analytics in their agency's 3 most significant decisions, the ones that were focused on non-financial topics scored pretty significantly higher, 3.3, in contrast to the ones that were motivated and focused on financial topics as the motivation for their analysis. So again, it's almost kind of a half-point swing. That doesn't mean that the folks who were focused on financial topics never had any impact, but it means they had less impact, less frequently. So the question here was, what have been the outcomes of analytics? What types of outcomes in a descriptive way in your agency? And the most significant and most frequent response here is employees or customers or stakeholders changed their behavior. So that's kind of interesting. The analytics were communicated and they had an impact on behavior, and it may have been your frontline employees, or it may have been your executives, or it may have been the people who you're trying to communicate with and trying to kind of get the public to change behavior. But the change in behavior and the persuasive power of analytics got the most responses. The next is, you know what? We improved our mission outcomes, our achievement, and it was significant. Our achievement improved by 5% or more. We did not try and validate this. This is simply, again, self-reported perceptions about your improvement of performance based on the analytics. So we achieved mission achievement. The slight difference here is that improved agency performance could include reduced cost, or could include performance against non-mission topics, perhaps back office or administrative topics. Less frequently, we got a plus up in our budget, 5% or more budget increase. Didn't get any result. Our agency became more responsive. It became faster, or it became improved customer satisfaction, or what have you. We cut costs, is least, 5.8%. So some respondents said, yeah, we did cut costs using analytics. But again, the bottom line, it seems to me, is interesting, because you think about, well, this is going to change a program direction, or it's going to change a financial outcome. And actually, to some significant extent, it changes behaviors, according to the respondents to our surveys, more often than other things. So let me see, I think you're next.
Yeah. So we then had a set of questions that address the resources, staff, and skills that are currently being used in government, and also what's needed in the future. And this is, of course, of particular interest to me, given that I direct a master's program in government analytics. So I'd be very interested in your feedback as well, in terms of what's needed in government. What sort of skills in particular do folks coming into government need to have? So we began by asking whether government has the data it needs. And we found that, generally speaking, respondents do feel like their agencies have plenty of data, particularly the data that they need to conduct day-to-day operations and also to justify their funding. We found, however, that respondents feel like they could use more data to inform their agency's big picture strategy and decision making. So a question to think about is whether governments just sort of analyze the data that they have, which is a lot, or do they go about this more methodically, start off with an audience and a goal and a question, then gather the data they need in order to address that question. We were also interested in whether government has the analytic resources and capabilities it needs in order to conduct its analytics. So while we found that government has plenty of data, it does not have the capacity it needs to make sense of all of that data. Nearly 3/4 of respondents to the survey ranked their organization as a 3 or below with respect to whether it has the resources and capabilities it needs to meet its analytic needs. So to build this capacity, we found that those in the government analytics community expect to hire staff across all skill areas. And this includes dashboard development, performance evaluation, database management, data gathering, as well as cleaning, and also model development. So the general expectation for hiring over the next 2 years in government is across the board. So we found that there's a need to build capacity in all of these areas that we asked about, and a pretty high need. In addition, we found that employers are very interested in hiring those who have a specialized credential in analytics. We found that 51% of respondents plan to hire staff who have an analytics certification, and an additional 29% may do so as well. So that's about 80% who plan to hire staff who have some kind of credential in this area.
Thanks. So what we're going to talk about next is kind of the things that folks attributed their successes to. Doesn't mean all of them were successful, but when they were successful, and those who were successful said, here's how I got to be successful. So the first question here was, what have been the most important types of successes you've achieved? And again, consistent with what you've heard earlier, it was mostly evaluating where we've been effective, and planning improvements is the most common thing that folks said, this worked well. Advocating changes to strategy or policy, not surprising. That was kind of one of the areas where in the survey's construct we defined that as, if you are successful, you will achieve this. Wasn't the top one though. Being able to identify and instigate changes to operations was next, just a little more than 20%. And using analytics as part of day-to-day operations. I thought this would be much higher personally, because I thought, you know, when a person who's doing a case management question and making a decision about whether it be, you know, an application for a benefit, or whether it be a decision, you know, in a kind of law enforcement case, they would use analytics and they would say, well, based on the analytics, this is what should be the decision for this individual case. That one was kind of in the middle of the road at a little more than 15%. And again, they fall quite a bit when you come to the financial topics, justifying funding and reducing costs. I was a little surprised by that also. Those were indicated as successes in just under 10% and 9% of cases respectively. So in this case, the question, sorry, there we go. In this case, the question is, where do you think there's the most promise for improvement in government analytics? And to a certain extent, this is improvement in government and improvement in analytics both. And what was interesting there is the top answer was statistics and econometric analysis. And this brought to my mind a presenter at one of the previous Government Analytics Breakfast Forum's comments, which was, he said, you know, when I have to explain to a layperson, for example, congressional staff, some sort of analytic result, an econometric model, which has some independent variables, and I can say, you know, we don't know for sure that they were causal, but those independent variables, when they change, they produce a certain amount of type and direction of change in the dependent variable, the thing we care about. That kind of cause and effect intuitive logic that has a direction and a kind of a denomination is pretty easy to explain. And so that panelist said, you know, I rely pretty heavily on econometrics. I don't tell people they're econometrics. I just explain them because they're intuitive. And I can't do the same thing with artificial intelligence. It's kind of a black box. And so he described that he was going to continue in that case to emphasize the kind of the standard statistical techniques. Nevertheless, we did find, though, that in the survey respondents, there was a tie between the statistical and econometric analysis and the machine learning. And they were barely kind of ranking higher than artificial intelligence. So again, we found a lot of interest and thought for promise in the machine learning, artificial intelligence, and kind of advanced techniques that are relatively novel. Search-based analytics, things like scraping the web to go out and find stuff, a variety of different sorts of methods that were named, blockchain, virtual assistants, we found to be much less prominent amongst those that were identified as promising. So the biggest challenge, as we said, basically, what's preventing you from succeeding? And the answers were, I have a hard time either attracting or retaining staff. People don't understand what we do. When you think about the kind of the communication topic we raised earlier, maybe it's because the people don't want to understand, but maybe it's because the analytics community is not doing a good enough job communicating. People are slow to adapt to a changing context, or perhaps the analytics efforts are. I can't get the data. Because you know what, I have a hard time getting data that I need from perhaps some other agency or even some component of my own bureau, or my own agency or bureau. The results of the analytics contradict expectations or contradict politics. Was only named in this case by 11% of folks. I thought maybe in the kind of political controversial stage that we're at, that would be a little higher. People are just unwilling to use analysis overall. Algorithms may discriminate, which is interesting. We had a breakfast forum talking about artificial intelligence and its prospective risk of discriminating in a variety of ways. And then the potential risk of hacking was seen as a small problem. So Jen's going to talk about the takeaways, and then we'll invite the panelists up to kind of give their perspective as if they were expert respondents to the survey.
So I'll crystallize a few key takeaways for you to think about as we transition to our panel. We asked our respondents an open-ended question about the most significant challenge for government analytics, and the most frequent comments focused on the following topics. In particular, people mentioned that there was a disconnect between analytic results and actions taken, and I think this relates back to the communication piece and the ability of those who are conducting the analyses to communicate what's meaningful about the results to key decision makers. People also mentioned data sharing as being a problem, the cost of data collection, privacy issues, and the lack of meaningful insight. So it's not enough to just throw a bunch of data into R or Stata and see what pops out. You need to generate results that have meaning. As Jeff mentioned, the previous GAB forums that we've held have echoed many of these issues, which I think underscores their importance. Relatedly, we asked respondents about what should be done to improve government analytics, and common responses here included building an analytics culture that includes both analysts as well as leaders, focusing on the most appropriate analytics for the task rather than on flashy terms and methods. And again, this kind of ties back into the question of, should we be focusing on traditional statistics and econometrics or jumping into the world of machine learning and AI? And I think what approach is taken needs to be driven by the substantive question at hand. Other comments included data sharing technologies and also building staff capacity. So on this slide, we've identified some potential next steps for agencies based on the survey results. And again, very interested in your feedback about whether these are indeed the right next steps. So in brief, we think that agencies should do the following. They should develop an analytics strategy that identifies priority audiences, the purposes of the analytics, and any gaps that exist between the data that's needed and the data that's available. We also think agencies should be using analytics to drive strategy, evaluate results, and communicate with stakeholders, that those sort of should be the three main motivations. Agencies should also focus on streamlining their data collection and data sharing processes, particularly across agencies. They should also identify specific ways that new AI methods can be valuable. And lastly, they need to, certainly not least, create an analytics staffing plan in order to build up this capacity. So again, that's sort of a brief overview of our findings, and we'd now like to invite our panelists up, and we will go back through and have a moderated discussion, and certainly invite the audience to jump in as well with questions. What do you want me to say?
Do you want to say anything that's kind of introductory remarks?
Sure. I will. I'm never shy. So I'm Bill Wojciechowski, Deputy Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the first thing I'm going to say is to apologize when I run out of here at 10 o'clock. But we have a brand new Secretary of Labor who keeps changing the time frame for my meeting. So so I'm trying to give my wisdom a little early. But the thing I'm going to say, I'll tell some stories about analytics. But I'm sort of the official cheerleader at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for analytics. I can't do it. I can't spell it. But I can see good things happening and encourage it as much as possible. So I'll tell a couple stories related to that as we go along.
Good morning. My name is Pat Whoo, and I'm a director of Bureau of Transportation Statistics at USDOT. So I'm like Bill. I'm a cheerleader. I think the entire agency is nothing but analytics. So we can talk about more about that.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Colin Pascal. I'm a faculty member here at the Center for Advanced Governmental Studies. And so I'm very pleased to be on this panel today with my colleagues here, and also to be have so many government professionals in the audience so that I can learn about some of the ways that you're all implementing these new tools in your own work. I come at this from the angle as an academic and a political scientist first, and a data analyst and an econometrician second. So when I think about the ways that we use data and the way we apply these tools, I like to think a lot about this sort of the institutional ramifications of them, the implications of it in terms of the way our government functions, and these deeper principles about sort of accountability, transparency, and notions of good governance. So even as we talk about more of the applied uses this morning, I hope that we can keep some of those deeper questions in the back of our minds as we move forward.
Good morning. I'm Michael Conlon. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the United States Department of Defense. With respect to my colleagues, I am a practitioner. I believe that the role of Chief Data Officer is a technical leadership role, and as a technologist throughout my career, I've always had to be hands-on with technology to be in the best position to understand its promise and to explain that promise to the business leaders that I support. And so I am a practitioner. I do work directly with the technologies in what time I can get out of my calendar, which is mostly jammed full of meetings, and whatever I can say from that. And throughout my comments, as we talk about the findings, which are quite interesting findings, I'm going to typically take two lenses. a supply side lens and a demand side lens, because I think that if you consider these findings from those two different lenses, you may interpret them very differently than the face value of the findings.
And that's really interesting because actually the structure of the panel is intended, we have some folks who are kind of data suppliers. We have kind of an academic and to a certain extent a representative from some experience at Congress as a kind of a consumer. And then we have a person who's kind of a consumer, a user, and an actor upon analytics. So I'm hoping that actually a number of you in the room will bring some additional perspective. What we're going to do is we're going to go actually back through the slides, and on selected slides, I'm happy, again, there are a few questions that we've kind of developed to begin with, but I'm happy to have the audience ask questions either of the panelists who will kind of help us interpret what did the survey respondents likely mean when they said that. You're certainly also welcome to ask questions of Dr. Bachner or myself about the survey results themselves if you would like. So the first question I'd like to start with is kind of what kinds of people use analytics and what roles do they play? And I wonder whether or not, Pat, you can offer a perspective, you know, who are these analysts that responded to this survey?
You asking me?
Well,
Who responded to the survey?
So they were anonymous, so none of us really
Who
knows.
responded to the survey?
There you go. That's fair.
Huh?
That's fair.
And
It's fair.
to a certain extent, it might also be, you know, a little bit about, you know, how did you become an analyst? A little bit about what
Yeah, I
motivates
can
you,
answer.
things like that. About, you know, what kinds of people are these?
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how I get myself into the data analytics, right? So I'm a statistician by training. So as a statistician, I think data analytic is all about what we do as a statistician. So I got into transportation because I feel transportation is an element in our everyday life, and think about what part of your life it does not touch on transportation. So that's how I got into transportation, and for 40 years, and I continues to like it. What is the second question?
Well, the second question to a certain extent is kind of what motivates, and this actually might be something where Jen could also kind of offer perspective, having seen a bunch of students, kind of what motivates people to get involved in analytics. And it's also useful to kind of take Michael's perspective. If you're an agency that's having trouble recruiting people, well, kind of the question a little bit is, what kind of people should you be looking for that are likely to be interested in analytics?
So, and I think, well, personally, or to the young people in this room, is you gotta have passion, right? So I get into transportation because I feel transportation contribute to our society and economy. And Bill got into labor, and I let him talk about why he got into labor. But I think to attract next generation is to understand how analytic can, I will only speak from the transportation perspective. How can that analytic help improve the transportation? And when we talk about improving transportation, you talk about how can we improve our congestions? That's everyday life that we face, right? So that is a operational perspective. How do you operate your transportation infrastructure or asset so you don't have all this congestions throughout the network? Or you can look at in the very long term. For example, we are looking at accessibility and mobility. It's like, do we have fair mobility to all our citizens? Are everybody had this equal opportunity or equal services provided to them from transportation perspective? Can they get to the places they want to get to, right? So if you understand what folks in transportation can help solve problems, then I think that I will convert you to work on transportation, because you gotta have that passion. You have to know what that analytics can help and what's problems that we can help solve.
So if you draw that out, it sounds like look for people who are passionate about a mission of a government agency. And because then, and especially getting better at that mission, because then they will be interested in analytics. And I wonder, Jen, do you have the perspective of seeing lots of different students?
Well, I think this is such an important point that I find that people who are successful in the program and in general doing government analytics, they come from a place of being interested in the substantive problem at hand, that they want to understand how the world works, they want to understand a particular causal relationship, estimate that relationship. It's not the numbers themselves or the methods or the programming that drives them, it's understanding something about a topic that they care about and finding a solution to a problem that they see as important.
So, sure. So Pat and I both are work in statistical agencies, and so one of the passions is sort of getting the data right, and so the numbers are important. We're surrounded by data all the time. I mean, I work in the labor department. There's a lot going on in the world of work and labor and changing jobs, and how many people took a ride-sharing service to get here today just didn't exist 10 years ago. So the world of working is different, but ultimately our job is gathering and processing a bunch of numbers and a bunch of sometimes unstructured data, and that can be very daunting, very routine, very boring to people. And so finding a way to do that, and in fact, a lot of the successes that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has had in using machine learning and other analytics is some typically younger person saying, why am I sitting here, and day after day, sort of this drudgery of going through this sort of boring data and turning it into codes and publishing it. There's got to be a better way. I learned in grad school there was a way to do this. Let me try this. I have one particular employee who does these analytics contests in the middle of the night with lots of other people, and it's like, I don't know anything about that, but I'm a cheerleader. And so, but it's giving those employees the latitude and the opportunity to do that, and the tools that are available to do that. And that's something that I think sort of drives that passion. So yes, we can meet the mission of the statistical agency, but we can do it in a way that's more efficient and allows people to use their knowledge and their tools.
Jeff, I have a comment here. So I think it is not only the passion. I think we don't have any alternative. If we are not going to collect data, it is not only passion. How are we going to evaluate the program, increase efficiency and effectiveness? That is one very important thing. But the biggest challenge that we are facing is rejection of accurate data. Because most of the time data is collected based on the result that we want. That is very true in pharmaceutical company and in epidemiological study. So the rejection of the actual fact is the biggest challenge that we are facing in analytics. Thanks.
Thanks. So let me pose the next question kind of to members of the audience. And this is the one I kind of hinted at, which is people spend more of their time gathering data than any other sort of activity. So my question is that good? Is there a way to streamline or automate data gathering? And I wonder kind of as concretely as possible, would you say, hey, it's possible to automate gathering of this sort of data perhaps, or here's how?
I think also having some sort of way to interact. So I'm with HRSA in the health center program. If we're looking at scaling up our telework, why wouldn't we be able to utilize the statistical data from DOT to see where the low mobility areas are? And I think those are the conversations that are really going to need to happen to eliminate us reinventing the wheel and gathering this data every time.
And right now, I assume that would take an extended discussion, some memorandum of understanding, perhaps some stripping of the personal information. So there are a bunch of different steps. Are there ways to streamline that kind of interagency data sharing, for example?
So the new evidence Foundation of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. Really, so we have a chief data officer here that probably came out of that or is part of that act. There are real pushes for agencies to share information where there aren't restrictions. So this sort of presumption that it used to be that people could sort of say, no, it's my data and I can't share it. There's now this sort of presumption that data is available for sharing unless there's some existing restrictions. So you mentioned privacy information. So certain health information or other private information can't be shared in a way that can then let people know who the individual respondents are. But I think that there's more and more push toward making data available for evaluation and for sharing across agencies.
Yes, and I agree with Bill, but I would like to caution the devil is in the detail. So when you want to share data, we say we're going to put our data out there. And as a statistical agency, there's nothing more we like the most anymore is for people to use our data, right? But how to integrate, for example, you talk about integration of data across. So the devil is in that detail. So what we try to do is make data transparent, right? So there's a lot of talk in the federal data strategy, excuse me, to develop a metadata about data. So as a user, you can then better understand how to, whether to integrate data across sources.
So I would encourage in real time, we had a representative of HRSA, a representative of the BTS, Bureau of Transportation Statistics, interested in data exchange, make the connection, meet each other after the conversation, exchange information, and figure out how it can happen.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'd actually like to take a moment to build on the panel's comments because they're very informative. One of the challenges I have as the Department of Defense Chief Data Officer is in the very clearly expressed expectation that we will promulgate more data. All cabinet level agencies are expected to promulgate more data, and for very good reasons. To support oversight by the citizen data scientist or by the legislature or by the executive branch, to enable ideas for improvement, to do a range of things to stimulate the economy and the growth of the economy, and that's all very important. The department occupies an uncomfortable position between the civilian agencies, many of which exist to gather and promulgate data. It's central to their mission. And the intelligence community, which exists to gather data and promulgate not a bit of it. We are somewhere in the middle. And everything that we publish, everything that we promulgate, we not only promulgate to US citizens and oversight organizations, but to our adversaries who are quite sophisticated in a modern world of great power competition. And so we get to the loose lips sink ships, loose tweets sink fleets kind of dialogue. And we have to ask, do we enable how do we enable transparency to our stakeholders, which is our obligation, without enabling transparency to our adversaries? And let's recognize that everything we've ever published in any form could be easily raked into Elasticsearch and run algorithms over it for the price of a grande latte at Starbucks. This is no longer expensive to do. And if you don't think that our adversaries are doing that, I would invite you to rethink. And so there's a really interesting balancing act for the department to achieve both of these goals simultaneously, because after all, that's the nature of the modern world. We don't get to pick and choose which of those goals we get. We operate in a democracy and we have an obligation to obey the law, and we do. So it's an interesting contrast. And so in a world of database reconstruction attacks, in a world of de-anonymization techniques, which are widespread and readily available, in a world of a wide range of open source data, it's an uncomfortable reality that managing that tension is non-trivial and requires a great deal of finesse.
So apologies for a moment. Ordinarily I would have just kind of gone straight through the slides in the same order, but we had our panelists kind of ready to respond to some particular topics, and one of our panelists has had a new boss ask for his presence. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip to the slides on kind of how did you succeed, and a couple of questions I'm going to ask there from Bill before he unfortunately has to depart. So looking again at success factors and key challenges. In this case, recall that the question was, what are the types of success you're achieving? And the most frequent answer was in evaluation and in planning or identifying potential improvements in performance. And so my question is, again, trying to kind of give some color to what the survey respondents might have said. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about one or two examples of how your agency has achieved something really successful with analytics? And again, I'd invite any other panelist or any other member of the audience to say, again, the purpose is to learn about something that's transportable between agencies that you can learn from each other.
Sure, so I'm happy to do that. So I think if I were answering this question, I would probably focus more on the day-to-day operations question. And you know, Pat and I are sort of in a unique area because it's all about processing data and and we're not involved in the policy range of things at all. I'll give two examples of where we've used some analytics in our day-to-day operations and in some of our planning activities. And so I think those are sort of the answers that I would have focused on. So we have a large survey of workplace injuries and illnesses where we ask employers to maintain a log of their workplace injuries, sort of consistent with the OSHA data that typically employers have to maintain. They can essentially provide this to us in handwritten form or to get onto the internet and type in sort of information. So they provide narrative information about how workers got hurt on the job. We have to take that very unstructured data and turn it into codes that then can be tabulated and published. And in fact, it's used by employers, by OSHA, by many others in saving lives for the future and identifying hazards on the job. So it's really important information. As you might imagine, people say things in very different ways. So we ask a question about the occupation of the worker. We get, in the case of what would be classified as a janitor, we have something close to 900 different words that are used to describe a janitor. And so, in the past, we had staff around the country who would turn those into codes. This is really, really boring work. And so we had young staff who said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so first using logistic regression models and then turning to these neural networks, which I can't really spell, so I don't really know what it is, but have had incredible success. And one of the ways that they had success was, one, to start small, two, to use it as a review tool before we use it as a coding tool, and three, to get those coders around the country involved in the process. So it didn't look like a robot was just taking over their job. And we are now coding, of the millions of codes, something like 60-65% are now being coded by machine with accuracy better than the humans. And we are expanding that to other programs. So the second example that we provide, we produce news releases all the time. I think somewhere in our charter it says, produce the most boring news releases you can possibly produce. We put out numbers, we do not tell you what the numbers mean. So on Friday at 8:30 in the morning, you will see the September employment situation. It will be written the same way that the employment situation has been written for 80 years. In fact, I have a slide that I use for presentations where I have a news release for the Consumer Price Index for 1955 and the news release for the Consumer Price Index for last month. And it is a little difficult to tell them apart. They're pretty much the same. The typeface is a little different, but they're pretty much the same. We have a natural language processing system that is reading the data and writing the statements that will then make those news releases. And right now it's just an experimental process. Even those people that pride themselves on writing the news releases, that agonize over every comma in those news releases, were impressed at what was going on through the system. We are actually working on revising the look and feel of our news release, more links, more interactive graphics, things like that. And in fact, as part of that process, we think that the natural language processing is going to write the first draft of the news release. There'll always be a human. Again, the robots aren't taking over, but there'll always be a human there. So we really are using these analytic processes in day-to-day operations.
So I have a hypothesis of my own that I'm curious about. My theory is, if one finds a critical problem that government's trying to solve that might be susceptible to analytics and for which the decision maker is at least open to considering analytics, and then one essentially kind of starts with that problem, develops the analysis to help answer the problem, then the analytics are likely to be successful. And again, my hypothesis is and then the problem is likely to get solved. And so it kind of goes to what we would call almost a user-centered design of saying, well, the analytics will be more successful if there is some user-centered design. And so I'm curious as to whether or not, do any of you agree with that hypothesis or disagree? Or are there other much more important factors to the success of analytics?
Sure.
So I think Bill referenced this evidence-based act, right, that passed in 2018. The entire, the spirit of that act is let's use data or data analytics to learn, right? So the big idea is every department identify a couple big problems that you want to learn from. So those are typically big policy issues that you want to learn from. Then you go through the process just like you described. Is we have this big problem now. What data do we need? What analytic technique do we want to tackle this problem? And how do we communicate the result? And the cycle should continue because it's a learning agenda. It continues to learn, right? So I think your hypothesis is right on the target. The other way around is, and my characteristics of there are people that find a data source and they walk around and they say, oh, how can I use this data source to do something? So I always say, don't run around with a hammer looking for a nail.
Right.
Let's find the nail first, and then we go down the path.
Absolutely.
Right.
Good. So let's look at the next topic briefly, and that is that key success factors, well-qualified staff. Can any of you tell me particularly, how do you attract well-qualified staff? What is well-qualified?
These days, the unemployment rate's really low, and so there's a lot of competition for well-qualified staff. But I think one of the areas is sort of getting back to that passion. And so, as Pat said earlier, people are interested in transportation. People are interested in labor. People can work on a key economic indicator that's going to come out once a month. So we have very young staff who are involved this week in putting together Friday's employment situation release. That will get a lot of attention from policymakers and from businesses and many others. So next week, I think, or maybe the week after, we're going to put out the September Consumer Price Index. That's the last piece of information the Social Security Administration needs to make adjustments that are going to affect millions of recipients next January. In fact, the day that comes out, in the evening, I'll get a call from my mother complaining about the Consumer Price Index and saying that it doesn't reflect her experience. But we have young staff who are very interested in that's something they can see the results of their labor immediately. So that's really important to them. But then the other thing is providing the tools, letting them use R and Python and Tableau, and providing the computing power to be able to do that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics established a data science users group, and this was about 2 years ago, I went to the first meeting. First of all, the room was overflowing. The thing that I noticed right away is I did not know most of the people in the room. They were all fairly new to BLS, fairly young, and fairly enthusiastic. They had done things in school. They were starting to look at the processes in their own office and saying, why can't we do it better? They would hear what somebody in another office was doing and share that. So I think opening up those opportunities to let people have influence on the way the work gets done and find new ways to do things is one way to attract and then retain employees.
Let me be provocative for a moment intentionally in response. And that is, each you and Pat have said, I want people who are passionate about transportation or labor. That kind of implies you're looking for someone who's kind of going to commit their career to transportation or labor, maybe not likely to move around between agencies or off to the private sector. And if they stick around for their career of, let's say, 30 years, maybe some of their kind of cutting edge skills won't be at cutting edge after 20 years. How do you deal with that?
Very big issue.
So, as respectfully, the millennial on this panel, I obviously work here at Johns Hopkins. I don't work in the agencies, but if I were looking for a position in that world, I would want to find exactly what Jeff was mentioning. I want to know that my skills are going to change and be agile, because millennials are acutely aware that the world is changing constantly. Like, new technologies are coming every 10 years, and the data indicate that I'm unlikely to have the same job for 30 years. Like, that paradigm is largely gone, and we're aware of that, right? I think, speaking for any millennials out there. So I would want to know that not only is it an issue that I care about, but I'm being equipped with a set of skills, both analytically and managerially, that will allow me to move around from industry to industry or within the agencies across time. I want my career to be dynamic, and I don't want to be stuck on any particular thing, because I know that things are going to change around me. So that's not necessarily an academic perspective, it's a millennial perspective that I wanted to share.
No, I actually think it's a broader perspective. I think through, if we parse this just a little bit, into roles that use data as a subset of what they do, knowledge workers, versus roles that are dedicated to data. So data wranglers, data analysts, data scientists, those kinds of resources, the statistical professions. The critical thing to understand for those data professions is that the state of the art is not being created in government today. It's being created in the commercial sector, and this is echoed by the President's executive order on AI and the President's management agenda. The state of the art is being created in the commercial sector, most particularly on the consumer side of the commercial sector. That means that in order to be successful within government, we not only have to give people line of sight to that, but we have to expand our professional networks into the commercial space, which is often uncomfortable for many government employees. And we have to bring those people into our communities. In fact, we have to foster communities of data professionals within the government itself, so that people feel like they have line of sight to the best, most interesting challenges anywhere in the agency they serve, and preferably anywhere in the federal government. And when they have that line of sight, they feel like they're part of something bigger. They are part of something bigger, and they're able to pursue those kinds of interesting challenges wherever they happen to be. Does not negate the value of domain expertise, and that's an important element of what my colleagues were describing. Utterly critical. But those domains operate in many places. We have a combatant command dedicated to transportation as one example. We're essentially a multinational conglomerate, so we do some of everything. But it's critical to create that sense of community and those professional networks, and to enable a flow of information and ideas and attitudes and approaches between government and the commercial sector if we're to be at all successful in any meaningful way. There's no finish line. This is not a race. The state of the art advances every day. The half-life is 6 to 9 months in terms of tools and techniques. So the minute you take your eye off of that, you start to become meaningless. You start to become unable to deliver the cutting edge of approaches, and that's just not attractive to any of us. We're all here in government service to bring the best we can do to support the country.
I have a comment that I would like to follow up. And you guys not just are 100% correct, but actually talking about millennials, which I 1000% agree with you, that connects precisely with the question. Where do we find well-qualified staff? And here's the problem. It's not that it's difficult. It's because the ones looking for that staff need to be open-minded. You are not going to find, the problem is that you look at the positions, they have to fit your, not the millennial, your agency. That's the problem.
Selection.
So you don't have the open mind and say, well, this person has never been here, but he has all the tools, the learning, the resume. Because everything now is, if you are not a multidisciplinary, you are done in the 21st century. So if you guys are open-minded and say, oh, this person that I want to hire is never working labor, but it brings a lot of expertise in the way to do data analytics. Things will change and you will find very easy a lot of people rather than, oh, it's very difficult to find well qualified. It is not.
So this
Can I
is,
respond to
please,
that?
sorry.
I think we are pretty open-minded.
Well, I don't mean you specifically, in general. The way they open the positions, the resumes, it's always specific to things very, very
Yeah.
enclosing within the work.
I understand.
That's what I mean.
I find this very interesting because I think the point, in a very quick nutshell, is we might be imagining a Renaissance person who is both a fantastic cutting-edge analyst, is tremendously dedicated to a singular agency mission, and let me throw in another, and is really good at communications. Odds are we're not going to find very many of those Renaissance people. So it strikes me that maybe, we're agencies, we're not just hiring one person, maybe we need a mix. And let me ask you bluntly, with the communication skill question, I've worked around a lot of analysts, a lot of them just don't like to talk a lot, bluntly. And so my question is, you all are really pretty articulate, and you have some analytics capability. Do we try and encourage our analysts coming in the door to be kind of that Renaissance person? Do we try and build them into it? Or do we just accept that some people are going to do the analysis and some people are going to talk about it and they aren't always going to be the same person? What do you think?
Can I respond?
Please.
So I agree with you, right? So there are some very happy, do our data analytics, present results and things. There are some that can go above and beyond that. It's not, no one is better than the other, right? So let's put it out there. So I agree with you in terms of communication. How do we, like Bill say, if you look at his chart from, 1920 something,
Right.
they look identical, right? So our challenge from a statistical agency perspective is, how can you tell the story using your data, right? So, for example, we are now training our staff to understand the technique to tell a story using our data. So we're now having a training section for our existing staff.
How do you train them?
I don't know, good question. I would like to attend the training. So we have one scheduled right now. There are professionals out there that teach us how to do so, right? So I think that's one thing. I want to address your question.
It was a comment in general.
No, it's a good comment, and I agree with your survey results. Public sector has a huge challenge in attracting the data scientists, and we just can't compete with Googles and Apples of the world, right? And then we have the hiring challenge. It's not like we can just go out and hire every day, right? Let's assume we can attract everybody, but we still have limit as to how we can recruit, right?
Well,
So what we do at Bureau of Transportation Statistics is we have established a fellows program. And the idea of the fellows program is I can't train my existing staff fast enough because the technology moves way too fast, right? So I can't train them enough with the new techniques. So the idea is to bring the young people newly graduated in the field that we like to learn from. So they will come in and spend about 3 years with us as our BTS fellows, and we learn from them, and then they learn from us. And they are not all in transportation. So we have data visualization fellows, and we have data analytics fellows, we have data curation fellows. So it depends on the gaps.
So you're using almost the reverse of an apprenticeship. You bring in the new people with new techniques, and the existing agency learns from them.
Because
That's kind of fun.
Like Bill and I, we're way too old to learn this.
So if I could just say just a couple of things. One, to the comment, there are definitely restrictions in government hiring with the occupation. So a lot of them have very specific education requirements. We hire economists. You must have 21 hours of econ. And so, but we are looking at some broader occupation series, like a data science series, which is more of a mixture of disciplines. And so, but that things move slowly, so that's certainly a slow process. But we've also used sort of fellows program. There's a summer program called the Civic Digital Fellows. We had a dozen college students at BLS for the summer who went back to places like Stanford and Berkeley and Yale, and these kids were amazing. And so we got them, we gave them a project and let them run. They had to, by the end of the summer, they had to show off their project. And we made a point of linking them with staff so that those projects could continue. And we could get more things done. So we, as Pat says, we can't train people fast enough. And so we will take all the help that we can possibly get.
Great.
If I can make a little plug here, I came from HRSA from Peace Corps, and Peace Corps return volunteers have non-competitive eligibility, so the passion piece already built in. I took a Tableau training about a month when I got, the first month I got there, and now I'm developing dashboards at the bureau level. So just a Peace Corps plug there, use the NCE.
We use a lot of Peace Corps volunteers.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit, and here we're kind of turning to the, well, everybody's talking about machine learning and AI, but nobody's doing it. What should we do about that? Do we just kind of leave it as a very promising sort of thing that we don't actually do?
Could I go first on this one?
Please.
Sure. I think that one of the important elements of this conversation is what's the level of data maturity in my organization to start with. If I have a relatively low level of data maturity, and I'm going to look at this from a demand side and a supply side lens, if I have a relatively low level of maturity on the demand side, if my people, my executives, my middle managers are relatively not literate on basic descriptive statistics, on modern visualization structures, on inferential statistics, if we don't have good quality data that we've curated and managed, it's very difficult to jump up to the use of AI. And in fact, you're likely to fail in almost everything that you do. You need to get the basics in place on the demand side in terms of literacy and interest, and then you need to get the basics on the supply side in terms of data curation and wrangling and basic statistical analysis before you can begin to go to the next level. And that's fundamentally about looking in the rearview mirror and asking what has happened. Once I know what has happened, and I can do that predictably in equality, I can turn my attention to what will happen. How do I predict what will happen? And this is where machine learning starts to become useful. But be aware that any algorithm that predicts will also mispredict. And therefore, you need a sophisticated audience to be alert to those dangers. Once you get to the point where you are good at predicting what might happen, you can then start to work on what should happen. How will we make these things happen? What steps will we take, and how do we know that we can have confidence in those steps? Confidence is important right across those three stages. So what happened and how do we know? What do we think will happen, and why do we think that? What do we want to make happen, and why do we think we can make that happen? These are important questions if you jump up to the use of artificial intelligence, however you define it. Before building those basics, on both the demand side and the supply side, typically that falls over and is not successful. Whereas if you build it up phase by phase, on both the demand side and the supply side, you're much, much more likely to be successful.
Michael, let me ask you a hypothetical, kind of building on that and something someone else suggested, Pat suggested just previously. Hypothetically, what you've said is the expertise and minimal capabilities on the demand side. The senior executive needs to know enough about visualization and a couple of other sorts of characteristics. But they've been there 20 years. Presumably they're the old dog that might have trouble learning a new trick. Is a way that it could work to bring in one of these kind of hot young rocket scientists at the age of 23 straight out of Berkeley to kind of tag team with them and bring them the capabilities and kind of teach them on a kind of a reverse apprentice basis. Is there some better way to strengthen the demand side than that model? And has something worked that you've seen?
Well, there are a range of things you do. That's certainly amongst the things that you do, bringing in talent from the outside to coach. So, sometimes the expression is reverse mentoring, a younger person mentoring a more senior person. Another fundamental technique is basic literacy classes in data quality, in descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, in modern visualizations. And it has to be approached as an executive literacy program.
So you send SESs to basic visualization, or?
We bring those to them.
Okay.
Because you typically need to deliver this in a one-on-one kind of scenario. They'll often feel uncomfortable about their lack of knowledge in front of their peers. And so you don't put them in that situation where they might feel uncomfortable. That's not productive. It has to be tailored to them as well, though. There's no use talking to a financial executive about data that is not financial data. There's no use talking to a transportation executive about data that has nothing to do with transportation. There's no use talking to the people at Defense Health Agency with data that is not medical data, the clinical or business management of data. You've got to tailor the content of the program to those audiences. Now, just to put that in context, we have an awful long way to go in the department. And a quick example of why I say that. There is an organization called the American Society of Military Comptrollers. These are people whose career is financial management. Many of them are well into their career, they're seasoned, they're smart, they're well educated, and they have these PDIs, Professional Development Institutes, on a regular basis for their continuing professional education requirements. I was a speaker at the National PDI in San Antonio in May, and I ran a workshop in which I had somewhere between 350 to 400 of these military comptrollers. And I put up a series of modern visualizations, starting with a box and whisker diagram. And I asked the audience, who can tell me how to read this diagram and where good is in the diagram? And of those people, the number who raised their hand was 1. And I put up the next one, and the number was 0, and the next one, and the number was 0, and the next one, and the number was 0. And we talked about descriptive statistics, and there were no hands, and so forth. These are not dumb people. These are professionals. They're well educated, but they have not been trained on these concepts and these techniques. And it is my obligation to help them be more successful by bringing that training to them in the manner in which I described.
Mr. Conlon, can you speak more
Agnes had to get in touch with me. Thank you so much. Sorry I have to leave.
Will you please talk more about at what level an organization can determine whether they have reached data maturity?
So we actually scored ourselves on the federal government's data maturity model 2 ways. We did a self-assessment within the armed services and within the major defense agencies and field activities. And we had external parties who had worked with us on data curation and data analytics challenges also score us. Now, the scale goes from 1 to 5 across 6 categories. And I would say that we have pockets of excellence where we are doing cutting edge work in data science. We're all the way up to the not only predict what should happen, but actually prescribe what we want to make happen and making it happen. So we have pockets of excellence where we're up there. But broadly, the self-assessment was that we were at the low end of the maturity model across the organization. And so there's quite a lot of work for us to do to raise that level of maturity. Now, with the evidence-based act we've been talking about, there's discussion of a new maturity model, but I don't think changing the model is the answer. I think that changing our skills and capabilities is the challenge in front of us.
So does data maturity refer to the amount of data or quality of the data?
The quality of your ability to generate impact from the data.
Impact on the data.
It's all, for me, it's about outcomes.
Right.
It's not about behavioral.
How frequently would you suggest like reassessing where you are in the FDMM and at what levels?
I'm sorry, I don't think I heard your question.
How frequently would you recommend assessing where you are in the federal data maturity model? And like at what levels? Like, do you need to be checking in at the top, all over?
So I view this a little bit like physical fitness. If I start taking my blood pressure and my temperature every day, I may be more likely to become just a little bit of a hypochondriac. Maybe that's me. Maybe not. Maybe everybody's not like that. But I do think on a every 6 to 12 months basis, it's worth asking, what progress have we made? How do we know we've made progress? What do we need to do differently to make more progress? This gets back to the spirit of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. Everything that we do in the data space should itself be tested against outputs and outcomes to ask, have we made the progress we want to make? But I think that kind of a frequency also depends on the scope and scale of your organization. We're kind of big, and we have this little bit of multidimensional complexity in the way we operate. So it can be a challenge to do it effectively across the organization. So that's a different factor. Is that a helpful answer?
Very, thank you.
So when it comes to AI and machine learning, I think that the data is important, but it is more about innovation, don't you think so? Like especially in military medicine, like what they are doing at University of Pittsburgh or Washington University. There is not much data, but they are innovating the use of artificial intelligence to develop new technology to take care of our troops. And of course, they have not evaluated the outcome of that, but it is about innovation. Innovation is innovation, right? Until we know what is the result, then we have that data.
Effectiveness is the measure of truth for me. Have we been effective in improving health or wellness for the service members through the use of data in the medical space? And I can apply that question to all the domains. If we cannot measure our effectiveness, then we are not complying with the letter or the spirit of any of the documents we've been talking about, the Evidence Act, the President's Management Agenda, etc. Do you need to innovate to improve performance? Well, you need to change to improve performance. Put whatever label you like on that. But I don't like to put the emphasis on the word innovation or digitalization or transformation. I want the emphasis to be on the outcomes. That is what's worked for me. Maybe other people are more successful using other language, but I think the concepts are utterly critical. That it's always effectiveness is our measure of truth.
I actually have a question to follow up on that for you then. So what is the process by which you define effectiveness, right? I mean, that itself is a meta-level question.
It is.
Which is not driven by data necessarily, but about your ancillary, don't want to say ancillary, but your other analytical skills. And so this speaks, I think, to the notion of like, what kind of talent do you want to bring into your organization? People who can also think about data, but also define effectiveness. So could you talk more about like the process by which you go through that?
This is, in my mental model, one of the biggest challenges that we have. How do we measure the effectiveness of the Department of Defense? What are the outcomes that we seek? It's easy to measure outputs. How many helicopters do we have with crews trained and equipped and ready to fly? How many tanks do we have? Same way. How many submarines? How many Aegis missile cruisers? You can measure outputs relatively easily. How do you measure outcomes when you're the Department of Defense? What's a meaningful outcome? How do we know we've been successful? Not to put too fine a point on this, we are at war in several places. We have been at war in several places for 17 years. Have we been successful yet? How would we know that we have won, W-O-N, one of those wars? This is a non-military question. This is a question for the American society to answer, for the American political system to answer. The measure of that outcome is not ours to define. It's simply not. And so we have a challenging issue to deal with. So we may seek refuge in measuring outputs over outcomes, because we can get general agreement on that. The executive branch, the legislative branch, the citizen data scientists, the taxpayers, I think we have general agreement on measuring outputs. Measuring outcomes, I'm not sure we as a country have clearly defined outcomes. And if you don't go to the right source for those definitions of outcomes, then you're deluding yourself in attempting to apply a measure, except as an experiment to see if you can crystallize that kind of conversation. But it is not within our remit as the Department of Defense to crystallize that conversation. We have other responsibilities. And so it's really, really difficult. Now, look at the National Defense Strategy, and this is directly germane. The National Defense Strategy has 3 major lines of effort, having made clear that we are now shifting from counterinsurgency to great power competition. 3 lines of effort. Number 1, increase readiness and lethality. Can we measure those? We can certainly measure readiness. Increasing partnerships with other countries. Can we measure that? We absolutely can. Not only in number, but in quality of relationship and cooperation. Easy to measure. Easier to measure. And then finally, reform the defense business enterprise for improved affordability and performance. Can we measure that? Oh yeah. We can measure improved affordability and performance. So we have plenty of places where we are doing exactly that, defining the measures, developing the data sources, curating the data, standardizing the data. And look, our CIO has released a digital modernization strategy which points out that we have over 10,000 operational systems, over 10,000 operational IT systems in the department. And I can tell you that they were all put in place by different people at different times with different budgets, different requirements, different profiles of risk, and they all are, from a technologist perspective, pretty darn unique. It then becomes difficult to create a common view. In fact, that's central to my remit, is creating an ability to get a department-wide view of affordability and performance. So there's so much work to do in that space around line of effort 3, the National Defense Strategy. We're working our way into the readiness and elements of it. That we're a long way from attempting to get to outcomes, and that really has to be done in the broader societal and political milieu, because it is not ours to define. And if that feels like I'm begging the question, I'm definitely begging the question, but I'm doing it on the basis of law.
Well, isn't it supposed
I
that
think that we can crystallize the outcome in terms of mortality, in terms of number of addiction and post-traumatic stress, and in terms of less distribution of the diseases as a result of war. There are so many ways that you can crystallize the outcome. But most importantly, when it comes to the human aspect of it, less mortality, less injury, less traumatic brain injury, less post-traumatic disorder, and
Less moral injury.
less moral injury. Thank you.
Can you speak a little about how you incentivize data sharing or process sharing? For example, if your bureau or an office in your bureau has a specific machine learning algorithm that's really helpful, how do you incentivize your other persons in your office to learn from them and also basically teach new processes and technologies? Do you have any kind of measure to data share and gauge per person's performance on data sharing?
Would you like to go first?
You go.
I feel like
Speak too much.
just what I was thinking. I talked too much. We start all of our data projects with an executive sponsor who has indicated a desire to get insights that they can act on. They want to improve performance. They have a hypothesis about the way in which they want to improve that performance. And we simply say, well, what data do you need to manage that improvement? And we document all the critical business questions they have. That's the very first step. Identify the sponsor, document those critical business questions. Because now all the data that you gather, all the steps you take to curate that data is with the intent of answering those critical business questions. And if you involve the peer stakeholders in that domain, in that early discussion, they now all have an appetite for the answers. And they have a commitment to encouraging the people that own the authoritative sources of that data to cooperate in the process of extracting and standardizing that data. And it is a process that does require cooperation. We have Title 10 authorities in the department, there are Title 44 authorities, there are a range of different things. And the practical matter is, I can't force somebody to let me into their data centers. I can't force somebody to let me have access to their data sets. I must persuade them that it is in their interest to provide that data to answer their boss's question in a different way than they can do it today. And so there are a lot of conversations, there's some begging, there's some cajoling, some vague threats, it's whatever you do. But it's fundamentally not positional authority that you're invoking, it's more about moral authority in that the executives are looking for these answers and we're going to support the executive's decision-making process. And the minute we get that cooperation, we automate every damn step of it. You automate it the first time you do it, so that it becomes repeatable, so you can improve the speed, so that you can manage the quality. There aren't enough human beings to do any of this more than once. So the first time you do it, you automate it as you do it, and that gives you the kind of quality and speed that you need. But it really is about the art of persuasion. There are a lot of memorandums of agreement that go on inside the department. There are all sorts of reviews. The privacy lawyers, the compliance lawyers, all these folks have to review the data that's shared and sign off on it. It's a non-trivial process, but it does require collaboration as a group. Am I answering the spirit of your question?
Pretty much, but for example, Bureau of Labor Statistics had a Digital Gov webinar about 2 months ago, and it was really helpful to see what they were doing in terms of auto coding, using NLP, Python, machine learning to auto code like injury codes. So does your agencies have those kind of events? Do you have a digital.gov platform? Do you go to specific special interest groups and present what you found down in terms of better processes, technologies, you know, your DevOps pipeline, for example?
So we do have a DevOps pipeline. I call it a data ops pipeline, but it's fundamentally the same sets of tools, right? It's GitHub for code, it's Ansible, it's Jenkins, it's Confluence, it's Jira for requirements, the whole bit. You have to have that pipeline. And we do a lot of internal community building activities, but it's mostly internal community building activities simply because of that uncomfortable position I was talking about between the federal civilian agencies and the intelligence community agencies. Sharing outside creates concerns. It has to be done in controlled fashions. But we are attempting to build a strong sense of visibility and community inside the department so that people can see those best practices, people can see that data, people can have a chance to learn from their peers. We are using ML in some very sophisticated ways and places, and deep learning as well, deep learning and AI. But those are pockets of excellence, I would describe. Setting a good example for others, but still pockets of excellence.
Let me switch gears a little bit to what may be a very simple question, which is kind of agency's budget for analytics, but I think it's a little deeper than that, which is how can we characterize value? How can we capture and measure value from analytics in order to answer a core question, which is 77% of respondents thought that their organization spends too little. And presumably they want to spend more, and presumably they might use some analysis to say, here's how much more we should spend. What could that look like? How can we identify value? What's the right amount to spend?
Maybe I can.
Please.
So, like I said earlier, as a statistical agency, our entire budget is on data analytics, right? So you start from data collection all the way to communicating your result, and your cycle continue. So their entire budget is on analytics.
So you're good at this.
Well, the second part of the question is a challenge, right? So I think we collect data for a purpose. We don't just collect data for the heck of it, right? All right, so and the resources is very, very tight. So the biggest challenge in terms of budget is what are the most critical data gap the transportation community is looking for. So I give you, and we have to request additional funding just to meet that chronically lacked data, right? So you have to request that data budget in order to meet that need. We also are using a lot of administrative records now. I think many of you in the room probably heard. One of the Evidence Act is encourage all of us to use administrative records because the budget resources to collect data is shrinking. So how do we balance the data needs and the shrinking resources? Is like you said, we go out and we beg and we borrow and we steal, right? We don't steal, but like we use Waze data now.
Sure.
To better understand what would be the safety trajectory in a highway system. So can I predict what happened tomorrow? So I can better position, for example, emergency vehicle, if there's an accident on the road, you want to clear that road as fast as you want so the traffic can continue. So if I have a tool that allow me to know what my tomorrow's safety trajectory would look like, I can be better position my operations, right? So we are now looking into, that's what I call the big data, is how do we leverage that? How do we leverage administrative records? And then how do we develop a hybrid data approach that fill the gap with traditional data collection approach?
So one of the things I've heard from you that I think is important, again, I'm trying to phrase this in a way that's applicable to a wide range of agencies, was we have a gap, which means we have a close relationship with a bunch of customers for analysis on our statistics, and they've told us they want X and Y and Z, and we currently only have Y and Z. Therefore, the gap we need is X. We go ask for money to fill that gap. So that's kind of one way you deal with it. Let me ask another kind of, again, a hypothetical, which is you could say, you know what? By creating this analytic product, we reduced congestion. And we've estimated the value of that congestion at $50 per person hour times 100,000 people for an hour's worth of congestion. So we quantify kind of the impact of the analytics. And at that stage, then we could say, you know, because we did this analysis, we saved this many millions of dollars, and it was, you know, commercial private money and time. Or on the other hand, perhaps it is we save this amount of, you know, local emergency responder time because there are fewer accidents and there's less police costs or less hospital costs. Do you do that sort of thing to kind of quantify, here's the value of an analytic product, or here's the value of a program, a whole bunch of different products?
What we do is, well, as a, not BTS, but transportation as a whole. Let's use congestion as an example. So there's a statistics, you might know about this Texas Transportation Institute. They issue annual U.S. mobility report. It is published in USA Today. So they identify segment of highways that have highly congested, and they estimate time waste, fuel use waste, productivity waste, right? So this information, and we're not talking about an average number in a national level. We're talking about at the corridor, at the segment of highway level, right? So the decision maker at the state level, US DOT doesn't own any highway. Mm-hmm. It's all at the state level, right? So state decision maker then decide how to improve that segment of the highway. You either improve the operations or you invest in adding another lane, right? So there are decisions being made based on the analytics. Does that answer your question? So I also want to point out that measure the impact of data analytics is long term. You know, unless you talk about operational improvement using analytics, you know, was emergency vehicle sitting there save X percent of congestions? That's short term, real time. But typically, data analytics are used for planning investment decisions. So
And
it takes a long time to see the impact.
Do you ever go to OMB or DOT budget office or congressional appropriations and say, hey, we reduced congestion, or we were the instrumental factor in deciding it wasn't necessary to build another lane of highway mile, and so we reduced the DOT funding for that? Essentially kind of to say, we've either saved money or we've created value, therefore you should fund us.
Okay, so you will not see a line item say data analytics. You will see a line item say improve congestions, right? Improve safety. But behind that, we have to use data analytics to support that. So we don't go and request, at least in department, BTS does, right? We go say we have a certain data gaps, and we tell you why this gap is important, and we'll get funding according to that. But typically, you don't see a line item just to say data analytics. It's all embedded for decision making.
Right.
So let me put
In fact, let me just amplify that comment. The Evidence-Based Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act listed a whole bunch of expectations and requirements. New roles, new responsibilities. It did not create new authorities. It did not have any budget associated with it. It's do more with what you have or with less, depending on how your budgets go. That's not a new challenge for anybody in government. It's not a new challenge for anybody in any commercial sector organization either. That's a day-to-day requirement. Do more with less. That's what all stakeholders expect. And by the way, the real world requires us to do more with less anyway, because the real world is constantly changing. That means we need to do more and we need to do new. So I come from the commercial sector, by the way. I've only been in government since July of last year. I'm very used to do more with less, with quite significant goals on both sides of that. Hard targets in terms of the more and hard targets in terms of the spend less. So this is not new to me. I don't think it's new to anybody in government either. And it's just part of the ongoing challenge. And would I like to have more budget? Sure. Yeah, would. But could I spend it without more billets? No. We're limited on the number of billets we can have. So there are multiple constraints.
Positions.
Billets meaning the term we use for positions. Typically in uniform, but we use it more generally to mean positions, both civilian and uniform. There are limits on those too. And by the way, downward pressure on those, and they're completely appropriate. Citizens expect us to do more with less. And so we have to be clever. We have to do the kinds of things you were describing, with taking advantage of open data sources and open source algorithms and tools and a range of other things.
So let me put on the table the question I kind of asked earlier, which is our best take about how you could evaluate and set the value of analytics was simply to say, are analytics used in your agency's most important program and policy strategy decisions? My question to you is there any better way to capture the value of analytics?
I think, like you said, it's very hard to measure, to quantify it.
Yeah.
So this has been a problem for the IT industry since its founding. What is the value of investing money in IT? How do you prove causality, let alone impact? Non-trivial question still has not been answered in the IT sector. Whether you view analytics as a separate discipline or as an intersect with the IT sector, it's not a new challenge. How do you demonstrate results and causality simultaneously? And there's almost always attribution and interpretation required to get there. And there's typically a pipeline effect. We invest today for performance change tomorrow or next year or the year after that. And it can take some time for the evidence to be generated in the first place, let alone to convince yourself that the evidence is meaningful.
Colin, you're unusual in that you have some experience on the Hill.
Yes.
Can you tell us what kind of drives the Hill's interest in analytics, and maybe going beyond, but what drives perhaps some of their appropriation decisions that may relate to analytics, whether it be of analytic agencies or of broader agencies.
Yeah, so I guess I was interested in what you were saying about, the value in your major strategic decisions as Analytics Incorporated, and that gets to the question of what is valued in the political system, period, right? I mean, members of Congress and appropriators, they have a lot of competing interests, right? On the one hand, they care about the outcome of the programs and sort of, are we getting better results on whatever subject domain, but also they care about process, they care about their particular constituent interests, the interests of the interest groups that are active in particular areas. So there is really sort of a multiple principle problem here, where value of what to whom is something that is being actively figured out by members of Congress. Ultimately, they want to be able to run advertisements that are going to demonstrate performance improvements in their agencies, and they're going to want to be able to go to contributors and say, look, I've delivered for you in this particular thing. But also it might just be that they have folks in their sites that want to provide services to the government, and they want to provide analytics as a supply because that's the business that they're in, right? So it's a complicated question, and trying to figure out what members of Congress value is something political scientists have been trying to do for 55 years with occasional success, I would say.
So, Jen.
I was curious if you have ever felt pressure. It's very hard to show that you've obtained value from analytics and hard to measure outcomes and demonstrate outcomes with evidence. Have you ever felt pressured to show more than you necessarily feel comfortable with in terms of demonstrating value obtained using data, and how have you approached that? Does that make sense? Or basically, have you ever been asked to show something with data or pressured to show something with data that you haven't quite felt like is there in the data, and how have you dealt with that situation?
Well, as a statistical agency, if we don't have the data, we tell them we don't have the data.
Okay. So you haven't come up, you don't feel like you have felt that, well, I guess maybe you've come under that pressure, but it hasn't bothered you. Yeah.
No, and I think that's why the evidence-based act is provide principles as a statistical agency, and one of them is the data quality, right? So if there's no data, if it is bad data with bad quality, we share that too. That there's always cautionary note as to we need to be responsible in terms of how our users use our data. So we have to be transparent. That's where transparency comes in, right?
Forgive me, that is absolutely the most important word in my answer to your question, transparency. I always take refuge in transparency. That's where I hide, right in plain sight, by being completely transparent. If there's no data, I tell them there's no data to answer your question. If there's data but it's not of good quality, I say there's no data. Sorry, we have some data but it's not of good quality. If we haven't performed the analytics, we haven't performed the analytics. If the analytics aren't valid because the sample size wasn't big enough, or the accuracy was too low, or the recall was too high, or whatever the measure is, if there was overfit, if there was data fitting, a range of things, you absolutely I owe it to my stakeholders to be utterly transparent about the reality of that. Can you make a decision on this basis? Can I help you make a decision on this basis? And in the event the answers are no, no, no in some element, the second part of my answer is, and if you're willing to invest a bit more money, let's have a conversation about how I can get you that answer in the future. If you're willing to shift the budget, if you're willing to shift resources, if you're willing to throw your support behind this, we can make a difference. But in the absence of the resources, we have what we have, and I won't masquerade for what it is. I have learned that if you are less than transparent, you put a line through your credibility, they see through it immediately, and you cannot recover from the loss of credibility that comes with anything other than telling it straight. And so that's what I do.
Do you see this as a concern, especially for young people coming into government? Do you think, can you imagine situations where they might be pressured by leaders, decision makers, especially coming from some political appointees, to ensure that their results tell a particular story, or is this sort of not something that shouldn't necessarily be that concerned about. Yeah.
Human beings behave in the ways you've just described.
So what would you recommend to sort of a young person in that situation where, they have an analysis and they're being pressured or they're encouraged to sort of frame their findings in a particular way?
So part of the response to this is actually structural. And the structure is creating a practice or a protocol for doing this work in which you have peer review.
Mm-hmm.
So there's more than one person who has said these results are useful, valid, and accurate. Second, you're asking critical questions from an ethics perspective at every stage along the way that shine a light on whether there are these behaviors to attempt to generate an outcome that is carefully selected. I mean, the spirit of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act is that we're attempting to eliminate that.
Right.
But there are human beings in the process, right? And so you have to create an ethical framework within your data science work, your data work, that at each stage asks appropriate questions that are fact-based and objective about the decisions made to position you for the best possible success in the next stage and the stage after that and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why Action 3 in the action plan for the federal data strategy is actually generating an ethics framework of considerations for data analytics. Very important issue, but you have to build it into the practices and processes of the organization to give those people who might waver a little bit in terms of courage, to give them that additional support. And then you have to be a strong enough leader to make certain that they can come to you with those issues and that you can intervene to neutralize those issues in an effective way. And that is an issue of leadership.
Yeah.
How often do you all use a peer review process, and are the peers independent?
They have to be completely independent, or all you're doing is whispering in your own ear. I mean,
Depends the product, right? So as a statistical agency, we release statistics or data. Like Bill say, here is our excellence rate. We give you a couple reasons, and this is not and we give a couple reasons of why. So that would not be peer reviewed, right? But if you are submitting a paper for a conference or presentation, at least in my agency, my BTS, our policy is always peer review among ourselves.
So
among the leadership, I have to approve that presentation going out. Doesn't misinterpret the statistics, does touch on the policy, because it is critically important we don't cross that line.
But you don't ask Bill to peer review something done by BTS, do you?
If there's a labor involved, absolutely.
Okay.
If we develop a methodology that involve BEA, for example, BEA is on board with us all, 100% of the time.
let me amplify that. Routine, proven processes don't need peer review. It's when you're doing new things that peer review becomes really, really critical. In my world, there's no cookbook for what we're doing, especially if you're at the cutting edge. We're making it up as we go along. And so you have to test that thing at every step with vigor, because you're literally discovering the answer by doing it. So it's when you're doing the new things that peer review becomes critical. I had one of my people, new data scientist, joined the organization, and he came to me and said, I took this data set and that data set, this one's outside, this one's inside, did a join, and I discovered this thing, and it scares the bejesus out of me. And he was right to be quite scared of what it appeared to result. And so he trusted me enough to bring that to me, right? Have I done the right things? Am I using the right data sets? Have I joined them in the right way? Am I reaching the right conclusion? And so we took it from there. We went step by step. We got the experts involved. Every step confirmed that we were using the right data sets, interpreting the data in the right way, et cetera. And some of those people had something to lose by the findings, right? You involve the community that will be affected in the analytical process because of second and third order consequences and because of unintended consequences. That's simply a best practice. And that doesn't mean they control the process, but it means they definitely have a say in what you're doing. So this is an example of we're doing something new, and so he came to me for peer review, and then I actually put an additional data scientist on it for the day-to-day work. And so I would say that that's where it's most important, is the new things. And then if you're going to promulgate it in a paper or otherwise, it's doubly important because the evidence actually requires us to not only promulgate data, but express a confidence level in that data, to promulgate the algorithms that generated that data, express confidence in those, and publish the source data and express confidence in it. And that kind of transparency, good stuff, I like it, requires you to be really clear in your mind about what you're doing, and it's most important in this time.
I have a question related to peer review in some ways. Both of you, I'm sure, report your data to the Data Act. You have to be in compliance with the Data Act. I was wondering, are you also a consumer of the Data Act? And are you looking at your peer agencies and identifying where you're spending more budgeting or spending more on a specific labor category or IT? So what nuggets have you found from the Data Act?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Can you rephrase it a little differently?
Sure. So in terms of there's a Data Act, the Data Accountability Act. So you're reporting, right, every quarter, I'm sure, and to be in compliance with what data you have in your agency that's being reported in terms of budgets and commitments, obligations, what have you. Are you also using that data? Are you going to data.gov, looking at what other agencies are doing with respect to IT spend, and using that information to compare how you're doing, your performance and your cost effectiveness?
I don't know what to hear.
Well, so I actually think you already heard at least one example of those two agencies sharing data. We have been looking at a couple of specific applications of that approach. Where can we take data from another part of the government has promulgated and use that data to compare against things that we've got? The example I was describing for you, Jen, it was one of those. One of those databases was actually a GSA database. And we're looking at some others. They're in such an early stage that I hesitate to describe them. But I will talk about one idea that is getting good support from sponsors. And again, we're not doing this as a junior high school science fair exercise. If I don't have an executive that is interested in the answers and it's not aligned with their goals, I may be wasting the department's resources, the taxpayers' resources, and the warfighters' resources, and I don't want to do that. And so we're in that stage of discussing with the stakeholders. There's a really interesting project published by an economics professor at Harvard that looked at economic mobility. And specifically, how does the place you were born affect your economic mobility over your life? Fascinating project. It was highlighted in the orientation session for the new chief data officers in the federal government. And there is a direct causal relationship between where you grew up and how long you lived there and your economic mobility. And they concentrated on the lowest quintile of households in the United States over a 30-year period. Now they did that merging census data with IRS data, or properly handled, secured, all of the privacy issues dealt with in a very, very careful way. And all of the results presented in a way as to do their best possible approach of de-anonymizing the data. Anonymizing the data. So then the question becomes, if it's clear that there are factors which shape your childhood geography, which have a longitudinal impact on your economic mobility as a human being, does the Department of Defense, does enlisting in the Department of Defense have a positive impact in offsetting some of those factors? Does enlisting in the department increase your economic, particularly your upward economic mobility as a human being. And so we've had some conversations. We think we have some executive sponsors for that set of questions, and we're looking at how do we bring that data to merge it with data we've got and test not only whether we've had a positive impact on economic mobility, offsetting those societal conditions, because we are a microcosm of the American society, but in terms of the supporting causal factors that were identified, have we had a positive impact in each of those as well? And can we improve the impact that we're having? This is ultimately the question. How do we do better? Which of these can we improve in order to have the kinds of results that we want? So that's an example of a project that we're standing up now, and it will not be a trivial exercise to produce. This is a serious number project involved in this. But I hope it's a helpful example for you.
Let me switch gears a little bit and ask, sorry, another question? Yes, I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask if anyone is able to elaborate on that slide. It looks interesting.
Oh, so let me actually ask a question about this slide. And again, recollect, I probably didn't phrase this quite clearly enough, but what your motivation was, your primary motivation for using analytics, we found played a determining role in whether or not you found those analytics had a big impact. So the bottom line was, if your motivation was financial, you were trying to use analytics to cut costs or to get more budget, you were likely to have less impact. You were less likely to report that analytics played a significant role in the 3 most important program or policy strategy decisions your agency made. And so the issue here is motivation for why you do analytics seems to influence whether or not the analytics have value or have an impact. Why might that be?
Yeah, let me have a go at this one. This is a space where isolating one factor is not helpful in understanding what is, forgive the expression, a Gaussian situation. There are multiple factors that intertwine here, and you really need to look at these factors together. In the event that you are starting out in your analytics maturity journey, you're going to spend a lot of effort attempting to generate enough cost savings to pay for the effort of lifting your analytics maturity, right? It's not budgeted for. There was not only was no extra budget, but it's not a line item in anybody's budget. You have to find ways to pay the bills for new tools, new data sources, new talents, and the effort of starting to build your analytics maturity. And so typically, and this was definitely the case in the department, we approached this first with how do we improve affordability, because that pays the bills for the next stage of analytics and builds credibility for the next stage of analytics, because above all, people in the department, and I think broadly in federal government, are keen on managing their budget. That's a set of expectations that everybody gets. And the comptroller community is very eager to have better data, so they're a natural consumer. So it was quite normal to start in the space of how do we improve affordability in order to create the credibility needed to get the funding to do the next stage and the next stage, because it's a very well understood, non-qualitative, highly quantitative set of analytics. And it gets intertwined with where you are in your stage of maturity and getting to a higher level of maturity in your organization. So I don't think that the question exists on its own. I think you have to ask, how do I map the answers to this question against where they are in their analytics journey and their overall level of maturity to get a richer view, because I think these things are coupled. I think there's some significant coupling of factors in this space.
I really like that explanation. I hadn't thought about that. It would be interesting to see how we could determine in a survey where your agency is in its analytics maturity.
Cupolas.
Because
cupolas.
My initial thought in reaction to this was actually one of great skepticism, which is if you are saying, I want this analysis done in order to justify a bigger agency budget for my agency, you're kind of predisposing yourself to a particular outcome of the analysis, and therefore you're no longer really objective, and therefore you're kind of choosing which data to use and how to construct the model in a way that's going to support your desired result. And therefore people find you to be less credible, and they don't pay attention to your analysis because they suspect your motives. So this kind of made me think of all sorts of kind of nefarious, misuse of analysis, and I like your explanation much better, which is basically, if you're at an immature stage in your analytics, people aren't going to pay as much attention, yet you're going to have to use the analytics in part to justify an increased budget for analytics. So I'm thrilled with that answer. Okay. Were there other audience questions that I missed?
Yes. I'd like you to clarify the difference between a statistic and data analytic. The way I understand it, we use a statistic to come up with some description and then formulate hypotheses, test the hypothesis, establish correlation, and hopefully cause and effect. But analytic is totally different thing. Analytic, we use it in order to diagnose and prescribe. So if you're a statistician, you're not a data analytics. But if you're a data analytics, you need to understand some statistic. Is that a correct understanding?
Well, right. So I'd like to kind of step back, right? I don't know how you define statistics, but how we use data is starting from diagnostic. We use data to find out why we have so many crashes on our highway system. So you use that to diagnose. Then you use the data, and then after you diagnostics, you come up with a solution or policy or program. Then you use.
That is data analytics.
If you want to call it that, I think that I don't know. Whichever label you want to use, I'm okay with you. With you using the label, but I'm basically characterize how that BTS use statistics or data for. If you want to call it data analytics, that's fine. If you want to call it statistic, that's fine. But this is how we use the data for, and how we use analysis methodology for. Is you diagnose the problem, you come up with the solutions, and then you evaluate how effective that solution is, and you continue this cycle. And I think that's why the Evidence Act is so critically important and timely, is exactly doing that. You continue that learning process, because the highway fatality is not going to go away. Maybe the next time the crash risk is opium use. We know that step, but we can't measure yet. But we have to continue this, right? How we want to label that, I'm okay anyway, one way or the other.
So epidemiologist on board.
Huh? Say what?
I hope that you have an epidemiologist on board.
In fact, I'm a biostatistician by training, so I do have some epi. A little bit, not much.
I think these spaces intersect. I think that a great deal of analytics leverages statistical concepts and techniques. It also leverages visualization concepts and techniques, because there are things that can be better expressed visually than through statistics. There are things that can be better understood through statistics rather than visualization, and often you need both to properly understand the shape of the data and what that data is telling you. There's a range of statistical categories, right? We have descriptive statistics, min-max, mean, mode, median, accuracy, validity, sample size, comfort factor, R value, etc., standard deviations, chi-squares. There are inferential statistics that have to do with random forest and k-nearest neighbors and Bayesian probabilities, and maybe there's a top 10 and there's a top 40. These are, and that space is actually a wild, wild west, and it's a lot of fun. But okay, there's statistical techniques. Can I do something, can I perform analysis purely qualitatively? Sometimes. Can I perform analysis purely quantitatively? Sometimes. But we're out in the extremes of a normal distribution now. in both of those answers. Most of the time, you're going to use both. And you're going to use visualization to express the results as much as you're going to use mathematical concepts like epsilon to express the probability of a database reconstruction act being successful. All right, that's a statistical measure. You want to call I call that whole space data management and analytics. I could just as easily call it data science. You're going to use statistics right across the patch. There may be people that only perform the statistical work as part of a larger team, and this is a team sport. To go back to the earlier topic about talent, this is a team sport, and cross-functional teams with diverse viewpoints are utterly critical to quality work. They're all going to be using some element of it. And even the data wranglers, the curators, are using tools now that have ML built into them that do the analysis on what you need to do to improve the quality of your data. Right? And that's fundamentally statistical in its nature, that analysis that's being done. And put what label on it you like. There are a set of skills you need, a set of domain knowledge you need, and by the way, we didn't touch on the people that only write code, right? And then there are the people that do all of those things I just described, right?
Let me ask one concluding question, and we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to ask if you can each spend 1 minute. And the question is, a lot of the success of analytics folks felt had to do with improvement of the mission achievement of their organization. What I'd like you to use though as an example from your experience, current agency, previous, that said, here are the mechanics of how that worked. So who created the analysis? Who listened to it? Who decided to make some sort of change? How do you know that that improved the mission achievement? So you can kind of help walk the path between the analysis being done and the improvement in the mission happening. Again, I'm happy to have any of you go first, but I'd like to hear a little bit from each of you, perhaps.
So I'll start. So I'm obviously not from an agency background, but let me tell you the story of one application of data analytics that I think is illustrative of the kinds of problems that arise when we're thinking about this in a political space. So recently, as a function of the First Step Act, which is a major piece of legislation regarding criminal justice reform, the Department of Justice was tasked with generating a new risk assessment algorithm, which is used to determine the likelihood of recidivism among inmates. And as a result of that, your score in the system they've generated, it determines sort of how many services you get when you're incarcerated, the length of your incarceration in some cases, and a lot of other factors. And so this is precisely the kind of like very value-laden task that we try to deal with when we're applying analytics to social problems, right? So if you were trying to take a bunch of data about rates of crime and likelihood of incarceration and recidivism, you're taking a bunch of data from the past, which is fundamentally bad data, right? Because it's biased, because of policing practices and everything else. Congress went to the Department of Justice and said, make a better algorithm. The Department of Justice went off with a bunch of data analytics people in criminology, various think tanks that had certain kinds of ideological leanings, and they came back with a new thing called the pattern recognition system, which they say is the best thing ever, and they throw some fit statistics at Congress, and they say, great job. We've improved our classification capacity by 23% or whatever the amount was. What do we do with that as a society, as a Congress? What are we supposed to think about? Like, is this really fair? Was the underlying data good? Was the process by which we went through this good? Is it transparent? And so, like, even though we think that this is an application where analytics is going to change everything, it really creates almost as many problems as it potentially solves. And so, to me, that's a really great example of the kind of things we're going through in government as a whole.
Well, and let's look at the rest of the value chain there, right? Is it valid? Is it accurate? What's the rate of false positives? What's the rate of false negatives? Have judges been trained on how to interpret the results?
No.
Have defense attorneys been trained on how to interpret the model and the results so that they can do their best role in representing their defendant, both, and this comes fundamentally at the sentencing phase of things. So, during the trial phase, you get to, as a defense attorney, you get to challenge data and experts presented. Without transparency, how do you challenge an algorithm or what its prognostication is? And if you're not trained on it, you can't interpret it. You can't do your job. Neither can the justice. The judge untrained is in an awful position. And then the rest of society. Is this giving us the rate of recidivism we want? Is it appropriate for all of the demographics it claims to be appropriate for? There are these questions that I think remain to be answered as a society. These are bigger societal issues. Can the layperson understand? Ultimately, explainability is a non-trivial issue here. We would have less credibility when lay people cannot understand how these decisions are being made than we will have if the average citizen can understand these things. We need to get to the state where every citizen is a citizen data scientist, and we are far from that state.
Given the deep concerns about trust in government and trust in our institutions, as we become a more data-driven government, that is just going to enhance the skepticism that many people feel like they're powerless, that their lives are being directed by these forces they can't understand.
Right.
That ultimately has, I think, very bad consequences for democracy. And maybe that's a different panel, but yeah.
You just hit the nail, because no one has mentioned politics, and it's my perception that all the government agencies are directly affected by that. And by politics. And one of the ones more affected, I think, is the Department of Defense. The government has appropriated already money for budgets. So your budgets and outcomes are thrown because politics. Can you tell us about that? Because your agency is very affected with money that has been already appropriated by Congress to do some things. It's been, by the executive branch, taken for something else.
I hate to say it, but we have about a minute left. I was hoping to hear
Well,
Pat.
there was no Q&A for us.
Well, I think if you guys are, I mean, you can always talk offline too. So.
Yeah, let's talk offline.
I think for me, accessibility and mobility for all citizens is very important, and we have done a lot by using data analytics, however you define data analytics, because we are not all equal when it comes to mobilities and accessibility. So when we talk about economics, mobility, upward mobility, it intersects with transportation. So we use a lot of those, especially in the geospatial sense. So many of you here use GIS, visualization, and we go down to small geographics. So I just came from have a presentation on women issues in transportation. So I'm looking at the women in this room. There are women issues in transportation. So how do we find challenges in pockets of women? So there are populations that are underserved by the transportation services.
Mm-hmm.
The low income, the immigrants, low income women with children,
Big issue.
rural populations. So there are many of those that analytic can help. We need to identify where they are, where are I call it transportation desert, if you will, that they have no way to access jobs or desirable job, have a better paid job or opportunity for education, right? So this is what I think analytic comes together, and you talk about data sharing. This is not just the data available in we gotta look at social demographics as well. So this is an effort that we integrate data from multiple sources. So, but how do we measure the impact of that? I think a couple years later, I hope that we'll be able to show you that we actually improve the accessibility of those underserved populations. That will be our impact.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their time and expertise. On November 13th, we will have our next Government Analytics Breakfast Forum, and it will feature Patty Cogswell, who's the Deputy Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration. She will be kind of offering two perspectives. One is, what does a senior executive look for and need in terms of analysis, and to a certain extent also particularly around risk within TSA. So I hope you'll join us for that, either in person or virtually. And again, I encourage you to meet with each other and to get to know each other to strengthen the community. Thank you for coming.